Good day. I'm glad to see everyone. Today we are shifting gears a bit from our typical Bible study that we do, which is based on the Revised Common Lectionary. Today we are going to move into probably a more specialized textual analysis, if you want to call it that. I am writing a quarter of the teacher guide for the adult Bible study, and the first 6 lessons are the first 6 weeks, and this will occur beginning the first Sunday of Lent in 2022. So it's a little over 2 years from now. But the lessons, at least to begin with, will be from the Gospel of Mark. And so for this session, I'd like to talk about the Gospel of Mark a little bit and how it fits into the New Testament. And then on this coming Friday, what we will do is we will take a pretty in-depth look, I suppose, at the lesson, which is Mark 8:27 through 38. And so we begin with the Gospel of Mark. Where does it come from? Well, the Gospel of Mark is one of 3 Gospels that are dubbed by commentators over the last centuries as one of the synoptic Gospels. Syn meaning one, optic coming from the word for eye. And so you could call these 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are called the synoptic Gospels. And you could say that you could see them with one eye, or you could see them all together at the same time. They're very similar in some ways, and most scholars, probably 98% of real scholars, believe that Mark was the first of the Gospels that was written. One of the reasons that they think this is because the pattern of the way the story of Jesus is told about his mission and his ministry is told in a very similar way. Matthew uses Mark perhaps as a pattern, and Luke does too. Now, Mark adds a lot of elements that aren't in either Mark or Luke, and Luke adds elements that aren't in Mark or Matthew. But together, most of the main part of the story and the traveling that Jesus does with the disciples is done in pretty much the same pattern, with the things that are added by Matthew and Luke being things like the genealogies, for example, or certain parables. Parable of the prodigal son, for example, is in Luke, but it's not in the others. And the parable of the workers in the vineyard is in Matthew, and it's not in Mark or Luke. And so that's where we see that. Sometimes people want to know, well, who is Mark? Is he the John Mark that we read about in the New Testament? And the truth of the matter is, most of the people that wrote the Bible, with very few exceptions, are really lost to history. They're kind of anonymous people. Now, from what they write and also the things that they address, we can sort of piece together what kind of community that they came from. Mark may be writing to mostly Palestinians, and sometimes we think that Mark is also writing to Gentiles, because from time to time we see that he uses various phrases in Aramaic, and he translates those into the vernacular so that people that wouldn't be familiar with things that were happening in Jerusalem, say they lived in Rome, for example, that these things would be explained. Now, there are not very many of these places, but there are enough for people to think that Mark was writing to a very broad audience, and he anchors his whole gospel basically in two places. One is Galilee in the very far north of Palestine, and the second place that he locates his gospel is on the trip to Jerusalem, to Judea, and then eventually in Jerusalem as Jesus meets his ultimate faith in the betrayal, in the cross, in the resurrection, and so forth. The date of Mark is very interesting. One of the main historic instances of note in the first century in Palestine was the revolt of the masses against the Romans and against the religious authorities, the Herodians, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and so forth. The people rose up, and this out and out rebellion began in the year 66, and eventually it was terminated in the year 70 when the Romans had gotten a belly full of the Jews, and they basically tore down, completely obliterated the temple. The only thing that is left from the temple that was there in the first century is what is the Wailing Wall, which is in Jerusalem. And so people date the Gospel of Mark sometime, most people, anything that you say about documents that are 2,000 years old, there is some guesswork involved. But most scholars believe that Mark was written between 66 and 70. There are some veiled references to the temple being torn down. In one of our lessons a few weeks from now, we will talk about Jesus cursing of the fig tree and then predicting the downfall of the temple. But one way or the other, people think it was either right before or right at the time of the destruction of the temple, which would have been in 70 of the Common Era. One of the other things that's interesting to note about the Gospel of Mark is simply this. Mark is very unusual in that he created virtually a new genre of writing in the first century. Now, the Greeks and the Romans each had what would be called biographies of great heroes. In fact, there is a school of thought that says that the Odyssey is a biography about Ulysses in Latin, or Odysseus in the Greek, and that the book that we know as the Iliad, which is a story of the Trojan War with the Trojan horse and so forth, some people see as a biography of Achilles. What Mark does is he takes a few of the elements of these ancient biographies, but he changed them into something that he calls a gospel. A gospel which basically means good news. The word evangelon comes from this, and what that word means for military people is the good news that somebody brings back from the battlefront. In other words, that this particular battle, which was far off, the courier or the herald comes and announces either victory or defeat. If it's victory, it's called evangelon, which means the good news of victory. And so in this way, Mark takes this particular word and he turns it into a story of the good news of God in Jesus Christ, who is Christ or the Messiah. And we will talk about that as we go along. Mark's emphasis in this gospel is almost exclusively on discipleship. Not only what does somebody say, but what does somebody do to be a follower of Jesus Christ? There's a lot of talk in this gospel about the disciples, and the word disciple basically means learner. And we have extended that, a learner who becomes a follower. What's interesting about Mark to me, and this is true for Matthew and Luke as well, is that usually students or learners or pupils go and attach themselves to a teacher. Socrates would walk around Athens and the students would come to him and cling to him as if he was some sort of magnetic personality, which he no doubt was. And what's unusual about Mark's gospel is that it is the teacher that goes around and collects the pupils. And so as Jesus goes about, he calls people from their fishing nets, calls people from their boats, he calls people from their tax tables. And so he puts a special emphasis on Jesus having a lot to do with who gets selected to become one of his learners or one of his disciples. Mark, it seems, is in quite a hurry to push this story out. There are a lot of things about Mark's gospel that he just doesn't seem to care about. He doesn't care about the infancy stories about Jesus or the genealogies that accompany those stories. He seems to be very, very intent on getting these words out. I cannot remember off the top of my head right now how many times the word immediately is used in the Gospel of Mark, but it is used many, many times. The Gospel of Mark's only 16 chapters. And when Mark gets to the last chapter, which is chapter 16, verse 8, he just quits. It says in that chapter that the women have a conversation with somebody at the tomb, and Jesus, we think, basically says, go and tell the disciples to meet him in Galilee. And so they begin in Galilee and they go all the way around this ministry, and they end up being sent back to Galilee, which, as I said earlier, was in the far north. In fact, it's so far north that it's the last thing before one goes into the countries north of there, Syria and so forth. So this idea of Mark is one that denigrates the disciples. At the very beginning, they look semi-heroic, but as time goes on, Mark makes sure that all of his readers understand that even though the disciples spend every day and every night with Jesus for a period of 3 years, that even at the end of his ministry, even as he is being crucified, that they don't have a clue about who he is or what he is asking of them. And eventually, as we move on from the end of Mark, obviously the disciples get the message, and after Jesus is gone and the Holy Spirit comes, they begin to be those people who become heroic and are the stained glass heroes that we see in our churches today. But Mark is a fascinating gospel. Many people recommend that one would just read it straight through, even read it out loud, because it is a story to be told about Jesus, about why he's come, and about who he is. And so on Friday, we will get back together and we will look at our text that day, which is Mark 8:27 through 38. So thank you for being with me for the Adult Bible Study teaching session.